Hi, folks, and welcome to yet another episode of the Lex Rex Institute podcast. Today's one that we've been really excited to share with you. We've been hyping it up all year. Hopefully, we can make good on that promise. But it's an episode about, well, one of history's most fascinating minds: the life, character, works, deeds, and influence of one of history's most, well, I don't know. What word should I use? What captures the je ne sais quoi of Jeremy Bentham? What captures his unique brand of sophistry without having good words, irritating pedantry about every point, that most of which I think all of which he made up, and then implicitly rejects 2 sentences later. What combines his unique blend of complete self-assuredness and the only word I can think of that is appropriate for our listeners is going to be the word scholastic. But understand, when I use the word scholastic, because I use that because they kind of were also very fixated with detail that they made up that didn't actually have any bearing on reality. But when I use that word scholastic, just keep in mind, I'm actually meaning a much meaner word there. And you should sort of mentally replace it with a much meaner word.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
So Jeremy Bentham, why is Jeremy Bentham?
That's probably a bit more of a big picture question than we're typically going to get into on this show. But why are we talking about him? I think I can take a crack at that.
Yeah, if he doesn't have any merit, why is he worth talking about?
That's because
I guess it's because you can't talk to him because his head's not going to talk back.
No, that's true. His head.
And we'll get into that.
His head will not talk back. You can look at his head, or at least a facsimile of his head. Jeremy Bentham is one of the people with a truly outsized influence on all kinds of things that we take for granted today in political theory, in sociology, and in law and ethics.
Theory of law. Yep. And it's just kind of implicitly accepted. Like, there aren't a lot of Benthamites out there, right? No one's going to call themselves, I'm a Benthamite.
Very few, anyway.
If you look at what men today believe, and you compare that, in the realm of law, politics, society, and you compare that against what the average man in America or Britain would have believed in, say, 1750 or even 1776. A shockingly outsized proportion of the differences in our outlook and way of viewing the world are going to be directly attributable to Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah. And despite that, very few people know him for anything more than probably a 30-second bit in history class where your teacher told you
the head thing.
Well,
right?
no,
and then maybe utilitarianism. The greatest happiness principle, greatest happiness to the greatest number of people.
Exactly.
What makes something ethical, which is probably the worst ethical system anyone's ever come up with. But we, maybe not the worst, but it's
one of the worst that
we'll
isn't.
Get into that. One of the most logically poor, I should say. Like, it's not necessarily the most unethical, but one of the most ill-conceived.
Yeah, and one of the worst, I think, that anybody even remotely take serious for more than a few seconds. Like,
seriously, but yes.
Did I say serious?
Okay. You did.
Well, I'm tired. Forgive me.
You're forgiven. Anyway, here's our intro.
Look at these 3 words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Now, I believe, David, you were going to write a Jeremy Bentham song to sort of kick us off on this episode.
Well, you insisted that I do that. I want to make that clear, that this is not something I was volunteering to do. And at your insistence, yes.
Well, we play music a lot for these, right? Like, we have the Russian music for the Soviet ones, the French music for the French ones. There is no Bentham music because he's not really for a guy that liked happiness a lot and his ethical principle, he doesn't seem to have done very many things that would make the average person happy. So we got to make our own song about him.
Yeah, well, and before I sing it, first of all, forgive my horrible singing. I don't want to do this, but duty calls. And secondly, you need to know that in Britain, the common nickname for people named Jeremy is either Jez or Jezza. Okay. Jezza Bentham came to town, a perving and a peeping, hid himself behind a veil and watched while you were sleeping. We'll explain that a bit later.
Oh, that's good, David. That's very good. That's of course a reference to the Panopticon. For those,
We'll get into more detail.
Many projects. Yeah, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. There's a lot to talk about with this guy for somebody who didn't really do anything in his whole life.
No, sort of sat in presumably well-lit rooms. We'll talk about that later as well, and wrote extensively.
I suspect they weren't well lit. I think that's why everyone's objection to all his plans was there's not going to be any natural light here, Jeremy.
Yeah. Speaking of, it is 9:15 p.m. here, but as you can see, plenty of natural light in my bedroom, northern latitudes.
Truly, you live in the society built by Jeremy Bentham.
Right.
Anyway, so why Jeremy Bentham? We already kind of covered that. But who is this guy?
In his own lifetime, he was probably best known for his brother, who was a naval engineer and had connections to various politicians and diplomats, and was an attaché in the Russian court for a long time.
Fairly important ambassador. So Jeremy was kind of always a hanger-on. He's actually 10 years older. 9 years older than his brother.
Somewhere
right?
There.
Yeah, but nevertheless, kind of mooched off his brother his whole life, lived with his brother most of his life. I don't think he ever got married.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And just kind of tagged along with his brother. But this got him access to a lot of very important people. Foremost among them, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, which was, I think, is that Robert Peel?
I believe that's correct, but don't quote me on that.
And Robert Peel, being a scholastic fellow himself, actually, I don't think he probably wasn't, but being a lacking judgment, thought that Jeremy had lots of great ideas, and that was sort of the origin of these ideas flooding into Anglo-American society, and they only increased their death grip ever since then. But he was given lots of important projects as a result of being a guy that was kind of favored by powers that be in government. He was commissioned by Parliament to write the response to the Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about next episode. The official response to the Declaration of Independence. This guy wrote it. Was he ever given any other official duties? Or did he just kind of write letters to people telling them to adopt new social
I'm pretty sure it was that. We already mentioned the Panopticon.
That's the only job he was ever hired to do, was refute the Declaration of Independence.
He did pass the bar. And I was doing...
Well, they didn't have a bar exam at the time.
All right. He was admitted to the bar, I should say. Yeah.
He apprenticed as an attorney because his dad thought that he was really smart. Because, those kids who are really fixated on details and can remember lists of 200 items tend to be regarded by people as smart, irrespective of whether or not they have anything valuable to contribute. And his dad pushed him into law, saying, I think you'll be a great lawyer, son. He's a lawyer for all of, a couple months before he realized that he hated it because the English legal system wasn't something that he had invented.
More or less,
and was different from the way that he thought that it should be. And spent the rest of his life trying to come up with a new legal system to replace it.
So I was doing a bit of reading in some of the the academic literature about Bentham, and you get the sense that a lot of the people who write about him are doing their best not to openly insult him at various points, but
except for the ones that like him. There's a lot of those.
There are some who are gung-ho supporters, but a lot of the people who are sort of trying to write neutrally about him, I get the sense that they...
Well, you and I talked about this before, about how being a good writer gives you such an outsized influence in terms of like how good your ideas are. If you're a really good writer, you can have kind of crummy ideas and you can trick people into liking him anyway. Bentham's a pretty bad writer. So it's kind of shocking he ever got any influence, but reading his work it does not lend itself to endearment.
No. So anyway, as I was doing some of this reading, I came across something. Someone alluded to his career, if you can call it that, as a lawyer, and they they give the example. Someone came to him saying, "Oh, I feel that I'm owed £50 for some reason or other," and he looked at this person and he said, "That's a waste of time. You should go away. I'm not going to do that." And then the author of the article,
£50 is a
at
lot
that time, yes,
in
um,
1700s Britain. It's probably more than enough to cover the legal
and
fees,
the author of the article said,
especially if somebody who has no rent to pay because his brother.
The author of the article said most of his other cases went roughly as well. So that's an example of I feel like a lot of people, sort of have to write very tongue-in-cheek about Bentham.
So I've talked about the writing. David, can we pull up a few excerpts just to show what we're talking about? So this is the preface from Panopticon, which we'll explain what Panopticon is afterward.
Right.
But go ahead.
Well, and
This is marketing.
yeah, you'll
anyway.
get a sense of it from what he says. Morals reformed, health preserved, industry invigorated, instruction diffused, public burdens lightened, economy seated as it were upon a rock, the Gordian knot of the poor laws not cut but untied, all by a simple idea in architecture! !
That's not exactly what I was thinking of when I said that his writing's really bad. Usually it's this just abstruse.
Yeah. Well,
here, let me just find like a random
let me
section.
go. Well, let me go on, because that's just the part at the very
Sure,
end that he italicizes. So that's what he wants you to know. Sort of the the tagline is. Thus much I ventured to say on laying down the pen, and thus much I should perhaps have said on taking it up, if at that early period I had seen the whole of the way before me. A new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind, in a quantity hitherto without example, and that to a degree equally without example, secured by whoever chooses to have it so, against abuse. Such is the engine, such the work that may be done with it. How far the expectations thus held out have been fulfilled, the reader will decide.
Did that make any sense to anybody listening? I kind of doubt it. Now, I know that anybody writing in the late 1700s is going to have much more complex sentence structure than we do now. That is not what I'm objecting to. I love that style of writing. I think that's great. Jeremy Bentham is a bad writer. Like, that is just not well expressed. See, here's a random section from the middle, or from the, there's a fairly lengthy paragraph. Oh yeah, here's the light again. To prevent thorough light, whereby notwithstanding the blinds, the prisoners would see from the cells whether or no any person was on the lodge, the apartment is divided into quarters by partitions formed by 2 diameters of the circle, crossing each other at right angles. For these partitions, the thinnest materials might serve. Like, it's, the whole thing is just abstruse as heck. We did a book club on this book once. David, Alex Bostic, who's been on this podcast before, and I decided we were going to read this.
I should say you guys decided we were going to read it and basically shanghaied me into doing it.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's disclaim all responsibility for this now.
I will, because I was not responsible for that. I went along with it. I will, I'm not innocent, but
yeah. So we're still on who Jeremy Bentham is. The guy who invented the Panopticon. What is the Panopticon? Well, it's a circular prison where the warden sits in the middle and all of the cells are arranged around the perimeter of the circle so that the warden can see into all of them at any time. And benefits of this are that people can be watched and scrutinized 24/7, which Jeremy Bentham thinks can be used not just for prisons, but for schools and hospitals.
Anything.
Basically anything. Because where wouldn't you want to spy on people while they sleep? And that's what David's song was a reference to. He is a bit of a peeping Tom.
Or at the very least, he had the design sensibilities of a peeping Tom.
Yeah, if you read Panopticon, he really gets enthusiastic.
He does. It's... I don't want to get too graphic, but he does dwell at length on the fact that the person in the middle can see everyone, and they can't see him
all the time.
Oh, they can't see him.
And he points out, like, and whatever they're doing, you can see it. You can see it, even if it's things that they might not want to have seen.
And they won't know
It's too late. He's seen everything.
Yeah, they won't, the man in the middle, because it is supposed to be just one, unless at one point he suggests that the man's entire family will live with him in this one chamber.
And the kids can watch while he's asleep, remember?
In the middle of a prison. At one point he does suggest that, but most of the time it's just one man in there by himself. So he can't watch everyone at the same time, but the benefit of the fact that he's behind this sort of Wizard of Oz curtain is that they know that they could be being watched at any given time, but they don't know that they are being watched.
Yeah. I think it shows a lot about his psyche. So that's at least one aspect of who he is. He's also, probably more importantly, thing we probably should have started with, he's the father of utilitarianism. Yes. So utilitarianism, you probably heard in school. Jeremy Bentham might have been mentioned. More likely, Jeremy Bentham's sort of, not literal student, but
an enthusiast for the Benthamite idea, I guess.
Yeah, the next generation of Benthamic reasoning is John Stuart Mill, who's a much more well-known philosopher, at least in terms of like named philosopher. Other writers actually respected him when he was alive, not just politicians and people who matter, but people who get you notoriety as well. So John Stuart Mill really popularizes utilitarianism, but utilitarianism is best summarized not by Bentham, because Bentham can't summarize, but by John Stuart Mill, who defined it with the greatest happiness principle. Utilitarianism was that which brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. Yeah. That's kind of his theory. That's his big thing.
Right.
There's real problems there. For one thing, it doesn't really answer the question of what's ethical. It just kind of offsets it by one level. For another, it's very ambiguous what's meant by happiness.
Yeah, and
for another, it's not clear how you weigh multiple people being happy against degrees of happiness. All kinds of problems with this system, none of which Jeremy answered for us. So
there are lots of well-known philosophical critiques of utilitarianism, including things like, how do you know? First of all, on a very basic level, how do you know what actually gives people happiness? Does everything make everyone happy in the same way? And, are different people...
I think the implied model here is a democratic one. People vote.
Sort of. We can get to that in a minute.
And that's kind of a lot of the reason why this idea has become popular, is that on a superficial and kind of idiotic level, it pairs neatly with systems where people vote. Which were very new in the Anglo world when Bentham was writing, because like one of his most prolific years is 1776. Yeah. So he comes onto the scene right when Britons are learning about this new self-government thing, and then they see France do it, and they get it in their heads that what we did was a democracy movement, even though we talked about before how it was not, and we're a republic, although there are democratic elements, and they think, well, democracy, it lost us a colony and it overturned France. Maybe we ought to think about it a little bit. And then Jeremy Bentham comes along with this system that pairs well with democracy to an idiot.
Yeah, it says something about doing things that are good for more people, or at least could be read that way. Greatest happiness for the greatest number.
Right, and the only way you could possibly find that is voting. So. It lends credence to the idea of that system.
Or if you're Bentham, you think you can do it just by reasoning about things in your particular mode, and we'll get to that in a minute, I guess.
Because he's not an advocate for democracy.
No, his political philosophy.
In fact, he argues the sovereign is subject to no one.
Yeah, his political philosophy is perfectly compatible with just the most abject kinds of tyranny. Which
it's like everybody talks about like divine right of kings, like suggesting that every country that had a king believed in this model that was very specific to the Bourbon monarchy, and they're like, oh, that was the whole idea behind kings. No, nobody thought that. Only the Bourbons thought that. But Jeremy Bentham's model of the supremacy of the sovereign of a state is about as robust as the Bourbons' model of divine right of kings.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that when we get to his legal work. But anyway, he's not really a fan of representative government. That's why they hired him to write the critique of the Declaration of Independence. But what else about utilitarianism, David?
Yeah, well, utilitarianism runs into well, a lot of issues really. I'm not even sure where to begin with utilitarianism in some ways, because it's just
Well, I mentioned that it doesn't actually answer the ethical question,
no.
because they say that which is ethical is that which causes the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people.
Right.
That's a method for finding what is ethical. That does not tell you what is ethical.
Yeah. It makes every question about moral principles into an equation, really. You're trying to maximize the output of happiness from it.
And also one that's entirely subjective,
Yeah.
just with a large number of subjects.
Right.
You know, there's not, and this is central to Bentham's thought. So I want to really hit this point. And it's one of the most influential things about Bentham's thought, is the idea that man is the measure
Yeah.
of ethics.
Mhm.
There's not something extrinsic to man. There's not rules that govern man's behavior. Man is the measuring stick.
Right. Because you're fundamentally just trying to produce a psychological effect, namely happiness.
Yeah. And it psychologizes the entire administration of the state.
Yeah.
We are trying to maximize psychological benefit. That's the purpose of the state.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist to protect rights. It doesn't exist to prevent wrongs. It exists to ensure that people are maximally happy.
Right. And when we get into Bentham's personal idea of happiness, it gets even worse, really. You went with scholastic as your term for it. I might say delusional, but yeah,
A
very idiosyncratic notion of what makes people happy.
He does account for this, though, David. And that's
Sort of.
the next point I want to hit here is the term happiness is entirely ambiguous in a Benthamic model.
Right.
Well, why is it ambiguous? Because he's not clear about what he basically adds up pleasures here with the assumption, the implicit assumption that the person that has the most pleasures and no pains is the most happy.
Right.
So happiness is just something that relates to the amount of pleasure that you're able to experience. Anybody who's ever eaten too much Halloween candy can tell you that's not true.
Well, no, he accounts for that.
Yeah, he accounts for all the things that contradict his theory.
Right, but
and then doesn't seem to acknowledge they contradict.
No, it's so funny because he seems to be under the impression that he's doing sort of very serious, very, intellectual philosophy, but you then you look at the things he says and it's just being extremely specific about very childish ideas. So this is from a book that's called Principles of Morals and Legislation. So this is
his, if Aristotle had his ethics.
Yeah. This is
if
his.
If Bentham were an Aristotle, this would be his.
Right. And that's hopefully just the title gives you the sense of this is a very ambitious thing to be doing. You think you're going to explain to people not only what makes something right or wrong morally, but also how you should make laws that govern society in one book. This is all going to be.
Yeah. Well, he thinks those are the same.
Right.
And that's actually one of the biggest mistakes that he makes, that people very commonly make now, is a total inability to distinguish between ethics and legislation.
Yeah.
It's something's bad enough, or rather, I think probably the way most people conceive of it, which is even more Benthamic, when you think about it, is if it's a wronghood that affects other people.
Yeah.
Will make other people unhappy, then that's something that ought to be the subject of legislation. But either way, legislation and ethical principles are just directly related to each other.
Yeah.
In the modern view that he created.
Yeah. Anyway, so how do you know what makes something good or bad? Well, it should have the most utility. And here's what he says utility means. It says, by utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this.
Thank you for those synonyms, Jeremy.
Yeah, all this in the present case comes to the same thing, or what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness.
Okay, so that's the way that he phrased the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. As you can see, it's slightly less eloquent, while also not being any clearer.
Right, and then how do you know, the next question, how do you know how much utility something has? By how much pleasure or pain it causes, And then he says, here's how you know how much pain or pleasure
Mhm.
something causes. He says these are the qualities you look for. It's intensity, it's duration, it's certainty or uncertainty. In other words, like, is it definitely going to happen, or is there a chance it might not happen? It's proximity or
No,
remoteness. How soon or how long is it going to take?
That is these aren't methods.
No.
These aren't workable. These aren't something you can.
And then, all right, the one thing.
What's the formula for weighing duration against intensity, Jeremy?
Right.
That's what we need.
Right. And then to your point about...
I'd also want to know how to assign quantities to both of those, because those aren't really quantitative things, Jeremy.
Right.
But you can see that, people who say, like, trust the science for social policy, they're pointing back to this. Somebody that adopted wholesale Jeremy Bentham's method for arriving at what social policy ought to be would say, oh, it's great that we can now take samples out of people's brains and know how much dopamine is released by a thing, because now we can quantitatively measure intensity of pleasure.
Right. Which is, hopefully you already know why that's not true and why that doesn't work. But
well, it reminds me of the Soviets, who are like, in capitalist society, the amount of money that each person makes isn't fair and it isn't rational. So we should tie productivity to caloric intake.
Yeah, that was the only way you could figure out what work was objectively worth, was by measuring how much physical energy it takes to accomplish it. And then you pay that person accordingly.
Why is this more objective?
For reasons. Anyway,
because it's got numbers in it.
Well, Bentham's doesn't even have numbers. It just
no. That's the thing. For a guy whose system requires like constant mathematics and like arithmetic to figure out what you're going to do on any given thing, the guy seems to have a real aversion to math. I don't see any actual calculations in what he writes.
I will say that to your point about the Halloween candy and how eating too much of it makes you feel bad, he does address that, because he says, those 4 things we named earlier, those only apply to a single thing, but when you view it as part of a system, you also have to account for 2 other things. It's fecundity, or the chance it has of being followed by sensation of the same kind. That is pleasure if it be a pleasure, pain if it be a pain. And finally, it's purity, or the chance it has...
That is such an utterly scholastic way to say that it's going to be a long-term or a short-term pleasure.
Yeah. And then finally, it's purity, or the chance it has of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind. That is, pains if it be a pleasure, pleasures if it be a pain. So, you're the little kid eating too much candy. That's not a pure pleasure, because he's going to get a tummy ache, and it's not likely to continue making him happy. So, that's bad too.
Great. More non-quantitative factors that you must necessarily weigh as quantities against more non-quantitative factors.
Right. So anyway,
thank you, Jeremy.
The big question,
for the useless system. You get an F. You get an F for this, Jeremy.
The big question, very obviously, is how do you know what genuine happiness is? And that's a question that philosophers had been dealing with since...
Yeah, that's the question.
Literally the beginning of written philosophy. Aristotle talks about
If we
this.
knew how to do that, we wouldn't need your system.
Right. So
Thomas Jefferson's method I thought was pretty good. That, the pursuit of happiness, that's an unalienable right. We get to pick what we think will make us happy and do that.
Right.
Jeremy doesn't agree with that.
No.
He thinks that he gets to pick what he thinks will make you happy, and you have to do that.
Yeah, and it's hard to avoid the conclusion that he adds a bunch of...
He talks about that in his critique.
He adds a bunch of synonyms for words like happiness or benefit or pleasure, but ultimately he basically...
never explains them.
Well,
it's like if you had...
He basically seems to be just talking about pleasure. Like at the beginning of this book, he says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone...
Stimulus response. We're like dogs.
It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. And it seems like he's just kind of embarrassed to keep talking about pleasure all the time, so he changes it up sometimes.
Remember that list that you found that was like things you might not know about Jeremy Bentham? And one of them is, Jeremy Bentham was an atheist. Really? You don't say.
Yeah, the only thing that matters in life is maximizing your pleasure, and that's the only rule.
Physical sensation.
Yeah, it didn't take a genius to make that connection. Yeah, he's
Can we talk about the part where he talks about, I forget how he puts it, but talks about how some people have idiosyncratic
Yeah.
preferences that shouldn't be considered pleasure for some reason.
right. And that's yeah. So again, as we said a minute ago, the big problem is figuring out what makes people happy. Bentham seems to know what makes him
He's
happy.
got it figured out.
He definitely
Yeah.
knows what makes him happy, and that seems to be pleasure.
But the weird, no, the weird, I don't think so. The weird thing is, I'm pretty sure he acknowledges the things that make him happy don't make most people happy,
Well-
and therefore don't count as pleasure.
Sort of. I think. All right, so I'll just read this section. But so he's just introduced this phrase, the principle of sympathy and antipathy, and he says that you shouldn't consider ethics in light of that. And this is what he has to say about that. It says, by the principle of sympathy and antipathy, I mean that principle which approves or disapproves of certain actions, not on account of their tending to augment the happiness, nor yet on account of their tending to diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, but merely because a man finds himself disposed to approve or disapprove of them. So there's this.
He said earlier that obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain dictate all human actions.
Right. But sometimes people seem to just like things because they like them. And that's
even though that thing isn't a pleasurable thing, he likes it anyway.
right. It seems pretty clear that it's just he doesn't understand why some people like things that he doesn't like. And so to explain those things away and prove why they shouldn't be taken seriously, he says it's not that you take pleasure from it, you just like it. As though that's a meaningful distinction in some way.
Okay, so that's our first point about who he is. Father utilitarianism. Second point you got written down here is he was an obsessive.
Yes.
Which is quite right.
Hopefully some of that horrible prose we've read gives you an indication of how pedantically he thinks about things that really don't matter very much. But
my favorite part, I couldn't find it, and I'll put it up eventually if I do, but my favorite part in Panopticon, take a step back. This whole book is a series of unsolicited letters that he sent to a friend of his about his idea for a circular prison where you can spy on people. Right. And he sends them one at a time over a course of a couple years?
Something like that, yeah.
While he's living in Russia with his brother.
Yes.
Now, this is the same trip to Russia where ostensibly his purpose for going here was to convince the Tsarina to adopt the legal code that he was writing, that he just wrote from scratch, wasn't based on anything, made it up, to adopt, convince Russia to adopt it. And I guess that the Tsarina at one point was actually willing to meet with him.
Yeah.
Was in the same town where he lived, but he said, no, I haven't been working on my legal code. I've just been...
It's not done, and I don't want to talk about it until it is done.
And I don't want to meet with her, so I'm not.
I don't want to talk to Catherine the Great until I have this legal code done.
Yeah, but meanwhile, he was sending probably weekly letters of chapters of his book about how great it'll be to be able to spy on people in a circle.
Right. Right. Yeah. If you read Panopticon, first of all, the whole book is a just pursuit of an obsession. He got this idea in his head, which wasn't even his idea. It was actually his brother's idea to, design this circular building in the middle of
his brother, the engineer.
Right. And his brother's...
Who said, I want to be able to look at the way people are making progress on projects so that we can manage projects more effectively.
Yeah. So that...
And Jeremy, being a sick little freak, was like, wouldn't that be way better if we blocked off the guy in the center from being able to be seen by anybody and used it to keep tabs on people?
Right. Yeah. Rather than being a convenient way that a supervisor at a project could sort of swivel around and check what different work crews were doing and make sure everything was going okay. What if that were a prison and there was a guy in the middle who gets to just stare at prisoners so that they never have privacy all day?
Or a school.
Yeah.
So same thing with the kids. Or a hospital.
Yeah, no. That's part of my point, though. So the whole thing quickly shows that
in a hospital, you want nurses making the rounds. You want them to actually go up to patients. You don't want somebody to just be like, I think that guy might be dead.
Yeah. The way the book progresses, it's clearly he just got this idea fixed in his head, how cool a circular prison would be. And then as the book goes on, he seems to realize
it's fundamentally flawed. So he writes more chapters just explaining why those aren't flaws.
But also... the idea, it seems to be, to justify why he's so obsessed with this circular prison, He needs to prove that circular buildings in general are just a good idea. So
All of society could be based
everything
upon
could
the
be
circular
circles.
building.
What if schools were circles?
Yeah.
What if insane asylums were circles? You know?
So, this, I was trying to tell a story. My favorite passage in this that I couldn't find is one where at the beginning of one of his letters, there's probably like 30 letters in that he writes this. He says, I was reading pamphlets that I'd written several years ago when I was at a friend's house. He had them on his bookshelf and I pulled them out. And I read them. And I couldn't really make sense of what I was saying, but it seemed pretty stupid.
Yeah. But I probably still maintain that was a good idea because it was my idea.
Yeah. And then after writing this flight of fancy that turned into an obsession, which he sent in volumes as a letter, it wasn't even a real book till he added that awful preface that David read you earlier.
Yeah.
He became so embittered that Britain didn't immediately allocate funding to tear down all of its pre-existing prisons and replace them with panopticons, that after this point, his work becomes characterized by intense distrust of the establishment, belief that governments are controlled by secret cabals. He expected everybody to just clamber over themselves to have this thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he was so invested in this idea, so obsessed with it, that he offered to, for free, work as the warden in the sort of the test case version of this prison. He was like, I believe in this.
Will you, Jeremy? Oh, what a sacrifice. It's not like that's what you've always wanted to do.
Yeah, draw your own conclusions about what motivates a man to do something like that. But
I think we sort of moved from an obsessive to your next point, which is just a weird little guy.
Yeah, very strange man. Among other things, I think we alluded to this in a previous episode when we were talking about this series that we're going to do. He was concerned.
The preserving his body thing is a big one.
He was concerned, or someone told him, I think, that his friends would miss him.
Yeah, one of his friends said, well, I think he was in an argument, actually. One of his friends was like, well, we'll miss you when you die, Jeremy. Because I think Jeremy Bentham was explaining why he didn't miss people that died or something like that. And they said that. And he was so taken aback by that he thought, well, there's no reason for my friends to miss me when I die because I can still be with them. So he has his body meticulously preserved so that they can take it to parties with his friends and he will be there with him.
Yeah.
This is the man that we're trusting for social theory. Yeah. This is a man that supposedly understands human motivation.
Yep. If you go to University College London, you can still see his remains in display. Well, the head is no longer on display because apparently it has started to decompose beyond the point of presentability. So they've replaced the head.
They should leave it there anyway.
They've replaced the head with like a wax doll head, I guess. But his
oh, well, now I miss him.
His skeleton, though, remains on display, dressed in his clothing, with the fake head perched on top of it. So, yeah, you can go hang out with your friend Jeremy, and you won't miss him because his remains are still there. The matter.
Yeah, and the worst part of Jeremy's gone anyway, which is his ideas and his talking.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people, contemporaries were like, I visited Jeremy. He only likes to talk to one person at a time, won't let anybody else in the room. And he talks endlessly and won't let anybody get a word in edgewise. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't do that anymore.
No. Anyway, should we talk about...
Oh, do you want to tell the story about his nephew? That's a good
one. Yeah, I go ahead and tell that one. Then I think we should probably get into what he had to say about the legal system.
So at some point, Jeremy's nephew, this is the son of the younger brother that took care of him his whole life, notices that his uncle is probably a deeply unhappy man, or at least thinks he is, because I don't know how anybody could enjoy living this way. But anyway, he says, I think, I have some friends, a couple women, who I think you would really like to meet, and I'd like to invite them over so that you can meet them, Uncle Jeremy. And Uncle Jeremy responds, why would I want to do that? If I don't like them, it will not cause me pleasure, and therefore there is no reason for you to have them come. And if I do like them, all the more reason not to have them come, for I shall miss them once they have left, and then I will be unhappy, in fact, more unhappy than I am right now. Therefore, there is no reason for me to meet your friends. And after this point, Jeremy's nephew did not try to cheer him up anymore. I actually don't know if that's
but
true.
we can
That
assume.
would certainly annoy me.
I think we can assume, because at that point, you could make that same basic argument about anything enjoyable that you could do. It's like either,
Yeah, emotions are transient,
Yeah,
Jeremy. This is something we have to accept if we're humans.
Yeah.
Like, you should be used to this because you've been a human your whole life.
has he though? That's the sort of the big question. What I was going to say,
He's been a scholastic.
what I was going to say is, you could, if his nephew had said, "What, I want to take you go karting or fly fishing or something, some activity we could do together for fun."
But when we're done, I won't be fly fishing anymore.
Right. Yeah, either I won't like it and you'll have made me unhappy, or I'll like it, but then we'll have to stop eventually, and then that'll make me even sadder. So I'm just never going to do anything.
Actually, the I have to stop eventually explains a lot of why he did the things he did.
Yeah.
They were things that he didn't have to stop eventually, and he would just keep doing them despite people's protestations that they're getting too many letters.
Yeah. All the things he seemed to...
The Post will keep sending them. You don't have to stop.
Mm-hmm. All the things he seemed to genuinely invest himself in were, basically things that could be extended indefinitely and that he could do by himself because nobody else would need, either want to be around him or would need to be around him.
Anyway, but the fact that emotions are transient is exactly why it's not a great idea to make your entire system of ethics and legislation predicated upon human emotion.
Right. And
because those change minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. So if you're trying to make something that's grounded in something that's like solid and can be relied upon, human emotion is about the worst choice that you can make.
Yeah, and in case you think that we're making assumptions here, he genuinely puts it in that same book, Principle of Morals and Legislations, that the people making law for your society should also be thinking about pleasures and pains when they make law. Like that's not just an assumption
Right.
we're making based on the things he said about ethics. He out and out says it. So Congress, in our context, should be thinking, what could we do that will bring people the most pleasure? And that's what we're going to make a law that will accomplish.
And the worst part is, I think they do that now.
Not
because Jeremy Bentham talked
probably
about this.
Not that that probably doesn't literally describe the thought process, but in many ways, yeah.
No, what's going to be good for my constituents?
Right. Yeah.
I don't care if it's constitutional. What's going to be good for my constituents? What'll make them happy?
And I do think that this is something we complain about all the time, that people misread the situation in the U.S. They misunderstand what the Constitution is and how it works, and thinks that if nothing expressly forbids you from doing something, that you can do it. And that's most things. The Constitution doesn't have a lot specific to say about what you can't do. That's just not the way it's written.
So, like 10 things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So for the most part, you have these lawmakers and they just spend all day thinking about what's the most beneficial to the most people, especially the most people who vote for me, because that's to my benefit as well. But yeah.
Well, that's not the. I mean, even irrespective of the U.S. Constitution, I mean, you can look back to Cicero. The first question you ask when making a law is this right? Yeah. I mean, even if you eventually get to is this conducive to human flourishing, however one of the Hellenistic guys would want to put it, you have to first determine that it's not something that is inherently wrong to do. You can't ever have laws that are unjust. Justice is not a concept to Jeremy Bentham. No. And if justice is not a concept because the pleasure-pain dynamic is all that you talk about, well, that totally reframes so many elements in our society. Prisons become not about punishing wrongdoing. They become about rehabilitating prisoners. And then when they become about rehabilitation, people like to spin that all the time, like it's somehow a more humane system of having prisons. No, that's a system that justifies 24/7 spying on your prisoners because the state has an interest in their internal well-being, their outcome after this process is over.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not something where they violated someone else's rights and are now subject to punishment.
Yeah. We'll probably at some point, I'm just realizing this now, we'll probably need to spend a whole episode on the rehabilitation theory of justice. But
yeah, because I didn't explain that thoroughly enough at all.
No, but I think you're right, though.
But that Jeremy's a big cause of that theory.
Yeah.
You know, that was not, nobody thought that prior.
No, and I want to say briefly, because there's probably some people out there who might say, "Oh yeah, why wouldn't we want to rehabilitate prisoners?" And I'll say, like, in brief, you go from a position where you're respecting the person as a moral agent. You say, we know that you understand right and wrong. You did something wrong. You should be punished for that. To the kind of person you are is fundamentally wrong. We know better.
You are a bad person. We need to fix
we
you.
know better. So we're going to make you into the right kind of person, and then you can go. And it doesn't respect the agency of that person.
I think it's sick.
Yeah.
I think it's sick. It's, punishments are specifically limited in the ways that they are to be meted out, and then that punishment is met, and then that person has no debt.
Right.
They can go back. They're free.
Yeah.
That's the way it ought to work. That's what we're fans of.
Yes.
Okay. Any more on just a weird little guy?
There are other stories out there, but I think maybe it's time.
What's this circumgyration?
Oh, yeah. So this is one that I found that I like a lot. This was another one on that list of 10 things you didn't know about Jeremy Bentham, and it was clear by the end of the list they were running out of interesting things to say. So this is one of them. Basically, he liked to take his exercise to keep himself healthy, and he would refer to it as making his circumgyrations. And what it turned out that meant was that he would jog around his garden, but he called it circumgyrating.
Yeah, that fits.
Which,
all right, then.
We'll talk about this in a minute, but part of his plan to reform law was to put things in plain language. And yet, instead of saying he would run, he said he would circumgyrate.
He would never do something base like running. No. That's beneath him. Anyway, so what kinds of things did he say? Well, we kind of talked about that a lot already.
Yeah. I think
panopticon, which is supposed to resolve all of society's problems somehow.
Yeah. The circular plan of a building is going to fix everything from prisons to schools to hospitals. We didn't even really talk about natural light, but
no, we didn't. That's a recurring theme there. It's it's a given that if the panopticon will work, everybody would want it, right?
For sure.
Because surely everybody has the same priorities Jeremy Bentham does. So only thing he has to prove is that it would work for its desired end.
Yeah.
And because he's a man of limited imagination, the only real objection that he can anticipate to this plan is that the orientation of the cells will not provide sufficient light for the prisoners to work. So literally, it's like every other paragraph throughout the entirety of Panopticon. It actually, I think it starts in like the third letter. So I really suspect that his friend he was writing to replied, yeah, but there's not going to be enough light.
Yeah.
So then for the remainder of the book, every other paragraph is like, this feature ensures that there is sufficient natural light.
Yeah, which he tends to write in all capital letters every time he...
Which makes me really strongly suspect the friend objected.
Yeah, that could very well be.
Yeah.
But again, you see the fixation on one thing, which is a pretty abstract concern, versus the more fundamental objection of
But won't this abuse what it is to be human?
Right. Yeah. Like, I know these people are prisoners, but does that really mean that you should just be staring at them all the time and they should never have any kind of privacy of any kind?
Yes.
No, that's not what matters to Jeremy Bentham. What matters to Jeremy Bentham is that there is sufficient natural light for them to do their handicraft, which that's part of the book too. Is we'll offset the cost of building.
We can make them productive.
Yeah.
That's how it saves money, because somebody's watching them do their work and can make sure they're doing it all the time.
Right.
Because you know how you work best, right? When somebody's staring over your shoulder, watching your every move.
Right. So not only will they have enough room to do their work, but also the guy in the middle will surely get enough light by some kind of contraption that we'll build to make sure he has enough light.
No, I think he was just saying these windows are this size. That's enough to light in plenty.
There
of
was
light.
something about a pseudo telescope at one point.
That's right. And if there's not enough
Yeah.
light, somehow you could build this elaborate, incredibly expensive machine with lenses in it.
Yes.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Anyway, as with every...
He would have been a big fan of anime if he were alive now.
I don't really know enough about anime to sort of make that connection, but I'll take your word for it. And it sounds...
I don't know that I do either.
It sounds like an insult.
I can tell he would have been a big fan.
But
nothing against anime, just...
But you see the tendency...
I think he would have liked it.
You see the tendency in every aspect of his thought to think he grasps the nature of something and then just fixate on one element of it while ignoring everything else. So he thinks he's got happiness figured out. It's about pleasure. So everything's...
And why are we stressing this fixation so much? Well, because in a lot of ways, our society today, at least in terms of our view of law and social order, is actually very hyper fixated on some really specific and not at all intuitive things that we just kind of now take for granted, as those are the things that you prioritize and care about when you're running a society. So what are a few of those things? Well, we've talked about a couple already. One is going to be the social utility ideas that have seeped over. A few others, David?
One of the big ones, in my opinion anyway, is sort of psychological validation. So there's been a lot of talk recently.
Trust the science?
Well, there's that for sure. But what I meant was this tendency to say, oh, don't use violent speech. So...
Yeah, that we should like mollycoddle everybody in the workplace and never give any criticism of what they do.
Yeah, well,
because studies have shown that people don't like being criticized.
Basically, yeah, and like it's one thing to treat that as like pragmatic, right? Like if you're a manager in an office or whatever, positive reinforcement works better. That may or may not be true.
Yeah, you're going to attract more flies with honey than with vinegar.
But when people start making arguments about limiting free speech, like this comes up on college campuses the most recently, but based on the idea that certain kinds of speech actually violate other people's rights because it invalidates their psychological sense of self.
Well, and that's the concept of harm that's been appropriated there is one that's directly from Jeremy Bentham's principles of moral legislation. If you look at the Old English common law, harm was something that had to do with actually, bodily harming somebody, or an act which was likely to give rise to bodily harm or cause somebody the imminent apprehension of bodily harm. It wasn't just stuff that you didn't like. But when your fundamental principle for legislation becomes maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, it turns out that things that aren't bodily actually matter a lot to people. I don't think they're properly the subject of legislation, but it can make people very unhappy if you say things they don't like. So if you're going with a Benthamic model here, legislation about those things is totally on the table.
Yeah, there's no intrinsic reason why free speech should be guaranteed in a system that's based on this idea. And part of the problem too is how much of a wax nose this turns out to be, because you can make an argument for anything, because again, you're talking about things you can't actually quantify. So, most people probably don't want to openly advocate for ending free speech. So, you can come up with an argument for, well, that's
very, we are still Americans.
Yeah. But, and so, you could justify to yourself, well, if we allow free speech, people are more likely to use that speech in the way that makes them happy and blah blah blah. The benefits would outweigh the negatives.
More and more I've been hearing though that there need to be limits on free speech.
And
that people say there's a limit on free speech. There's not a limit on free speech. The freedom of speech is protected. Now, not all things are part of the freedom of speech, but it's not limited.
And so things that we think of as baseline under this kind of philosophy are actually just a matter of perception, really. So the more people start to think, offensive speech is so bad, the more plausible it is that you can just outlaw certain kinds of speech outright.
Yeah. Well, and it's so bad because it causes a lot of people unhappiness.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Doesn't matter that it doesn't cause any harm that would have been cognizable under any legal theory known pre-Bentham.
Yeah. Or that you could actually demonstrate without, just appealing to, well, everyone says this makes them sad or whatever.
Well, displeasure is harm
Yeah.
now under a Bentham system. It doesn't have to cause damage; it just has to cause displeasure. But this all relates to, we joke, trust the science like it's absurd, but I don't think we really explained why that's an absurdity. It's an absurdity because the science never dictates social policy. It can't. It doesn't matter how certain a particular scientific theorem is.
Right.
Social policy is a different thing entirely. It has different calculus that goes into it, different priorities that are weighed. The idea of saying the science says something, therefore we ought to do that thing, is really a direct result of the kind of reasoning that you find in Bentham.
Yeah, because we've come to think only certain sets of benefits actually matter. That's the sort of the practical upshot of all of this is you can't actually know what makes people happy, but we can identify things that seem to make people happy most of the time, and then we sort of absolutize those things, and that becomes how you measure happiness.
All right, so the last thing we're going to hit is actually probably the most direct focus of at least our purpose, which is Jeremy Bentham at one point wrote a book that was in direct response to William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. And if you've watched our content before, the Commentaries on the Laws of England, written in, I think, the 1750s, were sort of the founding fathers' Bible for how the law is supposed to work. They have ideas of separation of powers in them. They have ideas about the origin of law, the basis for law, a lot of the things that you probably learn either through cultural osmosis or in some cases may have been taught a little bit about, like back in 5th grade, about social contract theory, about natural law theory. All that stuff's found in Blackstone. So needless to say, Bentham didn't like it. And he wrote a response, which is just called Fragment on Government. And it's not very good, is it?
No.
So he did write other things responding to Blackstone, too. This is the most widely known. But the main thrust of Bentham's criticism here is that Blackstone's legal theories are based more on tradition and historical precedent than, as we've been talking about, being based upon principles of reason and utility, as Bentham thinks that they should have.
And again, what he means by utility is tending to cause the most people the most pleasure and avoid the most pain for the most people.
Yeah, that is a preferable system, Bentham thinks, to tradition and historical precedent.
Right.
We're going to see if that's true.
Yeah.
I think you can guess our answer. Okay, so Blackstone's first couple theories are about, because I think as they rightly should be, are about justifying the fact that municipal laws exist at all. So he talks about laws of the universe. He talks about the creator of the universe. He talks about how human laws are derivative of that, and that's where he gets into kind of natural law theory. He talks about social contract theory. That's most of what Bentham focuses on here, because despite being an obsessive pedant who only cared about details, he didn't really care to talk about other people's details very much. So he focused on those big picture things. But what he ends up doing is he treats Blackstone's entire discourse on the origin and foundation of municipal laws as if it's essentially wholly irrelevant to Blackstone's project. And specifically, he finds it weird that Blackstone would see the need to justify the right of a government to make laws. He treats it as sort of a given. The governments can make laws. That's what they're for. That's what they're here to do. If you are natural law minded, if you care about constitutionality, I think you're going to take Blackstone's side on this.
Yeah.
We really want to make sure governments have that power before they start doing it, right?
Yeah. And you see already, we alluded to this earlier, Bentham does not think in terms of rights. That's not on his mind at all.
In fact, he explicitly argues against it in this work.
Yeah. So you don't need to be concerned that, a government doing X, Y, or Z will violate the rights of the people because the people don't have any rights. And you don't need to worry about whether or not the government has the right to do that because...
Well, he doesn't believe in rights or wrongs.
It's just, whoever can do the thing that makes the most people the most happy, which again basically means multiply pleasure the most, should just do it. No questions asked.
If they're in power, then that's what they're supposed to do. That's how you know if they're a good ruler or not. But anyway, he critiques Blackstone's ideas about natural law and the social compact, arguing that there is no basis for the idea that people naturally have certain rights or that governments are formed by social contracts. Instead, he proposes, of course, that governments are formed out of necessity to maintain social order and that laws should be created based on their utility to society. So here's a quote where he talks about this. If by state of nature a man means anything, it is the state men are supposed to be in before they are under government. So again, referring to sort of Locke's theory here about state of nature. Already he's wrong. Locke refers to state of nature as a state that is logically prior to government, not one that people were ever actually in. It's one that is presumed as a based upon the fact that men have certain rights intrinsic in the fact that they are people with the capacity to act upon their external environment. So anyway, misunderstanding that from the get-go. So, he this is the guy that sort of started that whole trend of reading Rousseau into Locke, if you know what I mean.
I think
because Rousseau talks about a state of nature as well.
Yeah.
And he means something very different from it than what Locke means.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of people, I think, do make that mistake because we've gotten so used to the idea, which is a very Rousseau derived idea of the so-called noble savage, that people who live close to nature.
Man is born free, and yet everywhere he is in chains, and it's society that imposes the chains in Rousseau's
view. And so people will look at that and assume that's what somebody like Locke meant, and it's not what he meant.
And then from there, they read it into Locke, which makes it get read into Blackstone, which makes it get read into Jefferson. So when Jefferson refers to the laws of nature and nature's God, people look at the Declaration of Independence and think it's saying something it fundamentally isn't saying. When you refer to natural law, what you are referring to is things that are shown to be true about what is right and wrong prior, not chronologically prior, but logically prior to any discussion about government. In other words, we need to have the conversation about right and wrong, what people can and can't do, before we talk about how best to order our interactions with each other. Because we need to make sure that ordering our interactions with each other is consistent with what's right and wrong. That's all the state of nature has to do with government. That's it. Jeremy Bentham doesn't understand that, and I think this is the real genesis of the fact that people don't understand that now. I suspect people will listen to my explanation I just given of this and say, I've never heard that before. I had no idea that's what Locke or Jefferson or Blackstone was saying. In fact, they may not even understand the point that I made, even though it's very foreign to our way of thinking now. And that's Bentham's fault.
In many ways, yes.
No, because nobody ever explained this point in the 1700s because it was obvious to them. Now the exact opposite's obvious. Anyway, he later acknowledges that Blackstone says the state of nature didn't actually exist, but he just sort of takes that as a stupid contradiction. It doesn't cause him to reevaluate the point that he had just made.
Right. That's a trend. I want to say something about that in a bit, but anyway.
Yeah, he does that
a lot.
This guy says this thing that he clearly didn't mean. Later, he contradicts this. No, he explained what he meant that you misinterpreted.
Yeah.
Okay, he also makes the classic and, extremely scholastic assumption that the social contract refers to an actual document that people sign.
Mm-hmm.
And then a sentence later acknowledges that Blackstone says the opposite.
But that doesn't matter because...
But continues with that assumption. I mean, this is when... You've probably... Actually, this criticism of the social contract theory may have occurred to you at some point. Is that I never signed the social contract. You ever heard somebody say that?
I don't think they usually mean it literally, but they mean, I didn't agree to this in broad terms.
Yeah, exactly. That is literal because contracts aren't just signed. You can have verbal contracts.
But the phrase signed, anyway.
They don't mean the signed part literally, but they do mean I never agreed to this contract that's now ostensibly being held over me. That's not the social contract. The social contract is not a literal agreement between two parties where government is one party and the people are the other. The social contract is an agreement by course of dealing that we have with each other to structure our social interactions in a certain way. It's like, it's no different than if you had a deal, if you were running a business and you were buying fish to run your restaurant or something, buying fish from a fisherman. And first time you did it, fisherman said, it's $100 for, what does fish cost?
I have no idea. Wholesale fish? No.
$100 for, we'll say $1 a pound. So $100 for 100 pounds of fish. And he sells it to you. Next time he also says $100, 100 pounds of fish. And the next time you just give him 100 and he gives you 100 pounds of fish. And you keep going on like that for a long time. That's a contract. That's a course of dealing contract. Yeah. So no, you didn't have to agree to the social contract. You agreed to it by being in the society that has it. Right. And by necessarily being forced to interact with other people. You know, it's a totally stupid way of conceiving of this. And I think it's probably the more common way to understand it.
I think that's true. Yeah.
You know, that the social contract was something way back when that people agreed upon, sat down and signed pen to paper.
Or at least that because that didn't happen means that the social contract doesn't really exist. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, like people might say our social contract is the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Yeah. Or they might say that actually people never ascended to that, so we don't have one. No, neither of those is the social contract. Right. The social contract is not an actual document. It's not an actual point in time. It's not an actual agreement. It's a course of dealing from the fact that we have the same traditions in history and have lived in a society together for a very long time. But Bentham doesn't like that.
No.
So anyway, he critiques Blackstone's respect for tradition and custom in law. Kind of naturally leads into that. So what Bentham suggests is that because law as an institution is old, does not necessarily mean that it's good or useful. He instead insists that every law and institution should be judged by its utility and ability to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. If you listen to what I've been saying, I'm not arguing that our society, the laws that it has, the expectations that are imposed upon us as a result of living in this society, I'm not arguing that they are good because they are old. I am arguing that they are certain because they are old. They can give us confidence because they are old. The expectations are known and manageable because there are lots of past instances that we can weigh against when evaluating future conduct. That's the reason why it's valuable that it's old, Jeremy. This isn't some kind of what's the fallacy, the historical fallacy, or argument from tradition is what I think they call it. You know, that just because we've always done it this way, it's therefore right. We're not arguing that it's right because we've done it this way. We're arguing that if it isn't wrong and we've been doing it this way, it makes pretty good sense for us to keep doing it this way.
Yeah, because as we've said on this show numerous times, one of the best things that a system can give you is predictability and stability. You know, you may not agree with every aspect of the law, but if it's predictable and stable, you know what not to do if you don't want to run afoul of it.
The argument would be obviously the first question you ask is the law just?
Yeah.
And then if the law is just, I think it makes more sense to go with a just law that you have rather than a similarly just law that you don't have, because the administration of the former is going to be much simpler than the administration of the latter.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's all the case law and all the rest of it. But Jeremy doesn't do that. If Jeremy wants to make the argument that tradition is an insufficient argument for the English common law, he has to meet the burden of showing that our laws are not just.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't believe in justice as a measure for law, so he's not going to be able to do that.
Right. Instead, he's going to try to show that they're irrational, by which he means they don't
meet his system.
Right. Yeah, they don't do the things he likes. Basically.
That's a common thing for people of a very scholastic persuasion to do, is to just arbitrarily insist that everything they do is rational.
Right.
Actually, I'm not sure how we haven't hit this yet, but a lot of why Bentham became popular early on was people saw the goings-on over in France. They saw that they were constructing a new rational system of laws.
Yeah.
And they said, we have a similarly scholastic guy over here who's been sending us letters about this stuff for decades. Let's see what he has to say. And obviously, Bentham ends up being a very big fan of the French. He's a big fan of the French Revolution. One of the only people I know of in history who's thought that their revolution was great and that our independence movement was terrible.
That has come into vogue in recent years as well. But yeah, for a long time, you're right. That was not a common
one of the only noteworthy people in history that I've heard say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've heard idiots on Twitter say it, but I don't really count that. I guess one broad point I want to make about Bentham's concept of government, which may be obvious, but I want to state it outright, is that there's no concept of trusteeship in his idea of government. It's not that there are rights other people have that they entrust to government so that they can be administered on their behalf. That's not something that exists. In fact, Bentham identifies only 3 types of duties. He calls those political, moral, and religious. And what he says makes them duties is that they are enforced by some kind of sanction or punishment. You'll find he loves the stupid lists like this. We haven't gone over too many other ones, but he loves those. But anyway, here's what he says about it. It is my duty to do something if I am liable to be punished according to the law if I do not do it. This is the original, ordinary, and proper sense of the word duty. Have these supreme governors any such duties, referring to like kings and people in charge now? No, for if they are at all liable to punishment according to the law for doing or not doing something, then they are not supreme governors at all. Those by whose authority they are liable to be punished are the supreme governors.
Right.
He doesn't believe that our rulers are subject to anyone or anything, or that they have any duties to the populace. Because they can't, because no one will punish them for not doing it. That's sort of the antithesis of what we stand for as an organization. We believe that everyone is subject to the law.
That's the meaning of our name as an organization is directly on point in the opposite direction. No, the supreme governors are subject to the law because the law is king.
Right. And even if no one punishes them for it, they are still liable for dereliction of their duty.
Right.
And I would agree they ought to be punished for it, but it doesn't make the person punishing them their superior. It's, these things are intersecting and cross-cutting. You can have authority over somebody for different kinds of things. You can think of, there's lots of examples of this, but, think about, so somebody might be a supervisor over somebody else at work, but they're also both on a recreational basketball team. And the one that is the subordinate at work is, what do you call a superior in basketball, David?
Team captain.
Is a team captain.
Yeah.
So he might be in charge of the other guy on the basketball court. It's just not hard to understand. It's not just a strict one-to-one thing. You don't just have superiors and inferiors. People have authority over different kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of resurrection of, I think we might have talked about this idea before, that in the revival of Roman law, which was sort of a Renaissance and an early modern phenomenon, but brought back in the idea that whatever the will of the sovereign is what the law is.
Right.
This is a sort of an
even though the Romans did not
idea.
think that.
No, but the fact that they had limited access to their actual legal texts made a lot of people think that's how it worked.
Like they argue. I mean, it's like everything Cicero wrote, everything Cato wrote, like.
Yeah, but when you only have the Code of Justinian
half
to
of
go
what
on,
Seneca wrote, like even Plutarch, who's a Platonist.
But if you only have the Code of Justinian to look at, you probably have a distorted idea of what Roman law was.
If the only tool you have is a Code of Justinian,
it's that same sort of idea that there's just somebody who is just sort of by status in charge of everything. But now it's
like the guy in the center of the Panopticon.
Yeah, that guy gets to punish everybody. That actually kind of is what the guy in the Panopticon was supposed to do. He was supposed to order that you be punished.
And they're not his superior in any way. They are totally subject to him.
Yeah.
In fact, they have no rights that are preserved from him. So it's Panopticons. The reason it's so illustrative of Jeremy Bentham's thought is that it is a microcosm of what he wants society to be.
Yep.
And he acknowledges that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, needless to say, Jeremy Bentham disagrees with the concept of common law and makes a very similar criticism to one that you will often hear today, where he argues that judges have effectively usurped the legislative power.
Right.
Because, you have binding precedent in cases. David, you want to tell us about his solution to that?
So Bentham's idea is, rather than having all this judge-created law, what if we just logically exhaust all of the possibilities? Taking
a step back, which obviously isn't judge-created law, right? I mean, judges are given common law rules, and then where there are ambiguities, they are expected to resolve them. They're not supposed to make things up that contradict past rulings. That's the principle of stare decisis. I mean, this is a common criticism people level against a common law system now, but it's just never been true.
No. Anyway, rather than all of that, Bentham basically thinks we should just make sure we have a law for all of the logical possibilities for things you might want a law against. And how do you do that? Well,
that's the problem, right? The reason we have a common law system is that you could never possibly legislate every point. There's always going to be ambiguities. Judges have to resolve them. Makes a lot of sense. And then we make that decision binding going forward. The solution, have a law that does account for all the possibilities.
Yeah.
I want to pause on that because that's so wonderful.
Yeah. And so how do you go about doing that? Well, you just logically exhaust all of those possibilities. So, he thinks you can divide any category into basically X and not X. And then you can keep doing that over and over again.
Who's he think he is? Charles Linnaeus?
Basically, yes. I read some secondary literature that commented that he was inspired by the classification. Linnaeus was the one who invented the sort of the original
the
genus, original
species,
taxonomy.
Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, whatever.
Yeah. So the idea being you describe until the point where you can't make generalizations anymore. This is this is the thing that's most specific that you can possibly explain.
Which, by the way, doesn't even work in biology.
No.
There are subspecies, there are subclasses, there are super orders.
Yeah, it turns out to have been a little too neat, and that
it works really well. Like it's a great system for categorizing things, but if you want something that is actually going to express reality in an unmitigated and pure way, you're looking in the wrong place. Charles Linnaeus is great. No criticism of him. But
yeah, no. It's a handy system.
The misapplication by people who try to do the same thing in the social sphere are the people who are stupid because they didn't even understand what it was doing in the scientific sphere.
Right. But so Bentham's idea is basically if we just keep doing this X and not X over and over again, we'll have a law eventually for everything that you could want a law for. But,
sounds like a plan, Jeremy. It's going to take you a while to do that, I bet.
And acknowledging that, you're
going to have to ask her to call again later when Catherine the Great shows up.
Yeah. Very humbly, though, he admitted you probably, it's not realistic to expect that we get this right first try. It'll take a little while.
That was probably after people complained that his laws weren't good.
Very likely, yes. But so when an ambiguity comes up where,
wait. You're not going to get it right first try? Wait a minute.
No, maybe not.
So you're back to the same system we had before.
Well, not quite.
Where you find out, because you're not going to find out they got it wrong until there's a case in controversy that arises, and who's going to decide that other than a judge?
Well, here's the system for that. And remember that the problem he has with the existing system.
Shall I put on a seatbelt?
Yes. Because the problem he has with the existing system is that judges create laws. So here's his solution. Whenever, an ambiguity comes up, the judge immediate, which is what he calls a trial judge.
Yeah, let's just rename everything.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because it's not like there are thousands of lawyers who had used these terms for centuries, and they have well understood meanings that won't be misconstrued now.
Yeah. But Jeremy Bentham does not like a lot of the traditional English nomenclature. He doesn't like the Latinisms. He doesn't like the French. He
somehow thinks that an invented term that only he uses will be clearer to more people.
Yeah, because once everyone agrees with him that it's better, they'll just start using it.
For a couple centuries, maybe.
Anyway.
So, I guess we're at that point now. Where it's now clearer.
So a judge immediate notices an ambiguity or a problem or something, and he proposes an amendment to the law to the appellate judge, or in Bentham's terms, the judge appellate, because you have to change that.
So is the case automatically appealed? Like, even if no one challenges the outcome?
I think only if the trial judge decides that it should be.
And then do the parties have to keep litigating it? Like, you got to keep incurring attorney's fees because this judge thought that the law should be amended? Or
I'm not clear on that. This is secondary literature. This isn't direct, and they don't address that question. That's a good question, though. I'd be very curious. But anyway.
I bet he hasn't thought about it. He didn't practice law long enough to think about that.
Yeah. So then the appellate judge, if he decides, that's a good amendment to the law, I want to pass that on, he passes it to the justice minister, who then does the same thing,
A
thinks about
bureaucrat.
it, yep, and decides, oh, that's a good idea, or oh, that's a bad idea. And if it's a good idea, he submits it to the legislation minister, who then does the same thing and decides if he's going to pass it on to the, I love this term, contested interpretation committee.
No.
And if they think it's a good
think
amendment,
that's a good idea.
and if they think that's a good amendment to the law, then they make it part of the law. But there's another way this can also happen.
It's brilliant, Jeremy.
There's another way this can also happen, which is that if the trial judge and then the appellate judge both agree, and then no one in the legislature decides to say otherwise, their decision just immediately becomes part of the law code. So
That's the same thing.
Except
he just gives a veto to both the executive and the legislature.
Yeah, except
that's all he's done. He's created an executive and legislative veto on judicial actions.
With the important difference that there is a way for judges to directly change the code of the law under this system instead of just changing the precedent.
Yeah, that was the problem with the common law system. Now, that doesn't solve the problem. It makes it
not
worse.
At all.
I feel like that goes without stating.
Yeah.
And it's like the criticisms are, it feels kind of like kicking a dog to criticize this guy. Because like, it so obviously has no merit. It's like, should I really rub it in? But I'm going to point out why this is not a great idea to do this. Rather than just having the judiciary get its fingers in the legislative pie, so to speak, you now have everybody doing it. Yep. So it goes first to what's going to happen with this system? The bureaucrat's going to effectively pick which ones get approved and which ones don't, because he has a budget he can spend. He can hire people who are underneath him. He can have tons of people go through all of them and then make recommendations to this legislative committee, right? Legislative committee is a committee. They have to examine everything with the full body present. They can't have separate delegations to go out and examine some of it. So they're going to rely very heavily on recommendations from the executive. So what does this do? Virtually guarantees an abusive administrative state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost designed to do that. Like,
yeah, except rather than having, our abusive administrative state where it's just tons of regulations, they're actually the law.
Yeah.
Like actual statutes.
Yep.
So is it not a coincidence that our society tended toward executive overreach, given that Jeremy Bentham was as influential as he was?
I mean,
that's his system. That is the system you just spelled out.
Mm-hmm. Are we ever going to talk specifically about Thomas Hobbes? We might or might not. Yeah,
I bet we will.
But
I kind of avoid talking. He's treated as way more influential than he is.
Right.
So
that's one of the reasons. But, this is a different face of Hobbes, but it's a very similar overall idea, I would say.
I think this would make Hobbes clutch his pearls.
It probably would, yeah, because it doesn't have any of the
the legislative and executive power are separate. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it doesn't have any of the rootedness that Hobbes has in Leviathan. It's just like as though someone took the worst sort of caricature of the Leviathan idea and was like, yeah, that's what we want. We just want to empower one body to make all the decisions for everybody so as to maximize benefit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would not be my first choice.
No. Anyway, so that's our introductory episode, I think.
You're going to get two more. Next one's going to be on his review of the Declaration of Independence. And then what's the last one?
We need to talk about exactly... I know one thing we're going to talk about for sure is Bentham's influence on policing.
Ooh, yeah.
We may have some other things to talk about as well, but for sure that.
Yeah, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We're way over already, so I think we want to do Captain Kangaroo Court?
I feel like this kind of was Captain Kangaroo Court also, just because of the absurdities. So maybe that should be it for this time.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, folks. Sorry if you didn't get your Captain Kangaroo Court. That's, well...
Next time. Next time. Sure. Yeah. All right, and stick around for our disclaimers.
All right. Talk to you later, folks.
See ya. Please note that nothing in this podcast constitutes legal advice, and all of the opinions expressed are the opinions of the individuals expressing them, not necessarily the opinions of the Lex Rex Institute.
The Lex Rex Institute is a nonprofit constitutional advocacy organization. If you'd like to learn a bit more about our organization's activities or make a donation, please visit our website, www.lexrex.org. LEXREX.org.
As a reminder, this podcast is a legal issues podcast, not a political issues podcast. We try to keep our commentary strictly to legal issues. Today, now that more issues are considered political than ever before, we believe it's especially important to distinguish between the two.
Thanks for listening to the Lex Rex Institute podcast, and we'll see you again next week.